Hello, and welcome to Trade Talks. I'm delighted to be here with Coriolis Technologies, Dr. Rebecca Harding and Dr. Jack Harding. Hi there, both. Every time we talk, it seems to have been a busy week to reflect upon and to look ahead to. So today we're looking at G7 and the Munich Security Conference, which is certainly a little more subdued without President Trump's attendance. However, I think one word which was of most interest to everyone listening was the word Westlessness. Rebecca, what does this mean?
Well, you certainly don't want to say Westlessness too many times in front of a mirror, do you? Because you get your tongue in a twist. But essentially what it means is almost a grizzle word that is about the shifting spheres of influence that we've seen over the last 30 years since globalization. So essentially it's the decline of the Western alliance that's dominated the geoeconomic, geopolitical framework since the Second World War. In essence, what it meant at the Munich Security Conference, though, was the need for the Western alliance to come back together against what it sees as the rising economic and technological power of China, the sharp power, in other words, control over technology and the messaging behind technology that Russia has exerted. This is the fake news agenda and everything, but China has some influence over that as well. And essentially it's the West looking at itself and saying, how did that happen? What was it that went wrong? We need to recalibrate, we need to reassert ourselves. And I think there's a reason why this matters hugely in the context of moving into this year, which is about post-COVID, post-Brexit and post-Trump. It's because a lot of the grizzles are still there. A lot of the complaints about globalization are still there. So inequality, the haves and have-nots, you know, the rise of China means that there are people feeling that in the West that their jobs have been displaced. The decline of globalization, the fact that globalization has almost become a dirty word, and this has created a rise of economic nationalism. So the legacy is really about what the Munich Security Conference was focusing on, and it's an attempt to bring everything back together again.
And Jack, Westlessness, what does it mean in security terms, and does it matter?
Yeah, well, I mean, Rebecca hit the nail on the head. I think it means broadly the same thing in security terms. It's essentially the concept that the West's post-Cold War geopolitical dominance is being eroded, partially by the rise of China and Russia, deviation from the rules-based international order, and I mean, also the rise of non-state actors. And I mean, this relates to this sort of cybersecurity domain as well. And the cherry on top of everything has been the rise of populism and the rise of nationalism, which has been fomented by election interference by non-state and possibly state actors as well. So we saw interference in the US elections and Brexit as well. So, I mean, the concern basically was that Western democracy was essentially devouring itself, and it was undermining the relevance or the effectiveness of transnational organizations, security-based organizations like NATO. So this idea of Westlessness, in fact, the theme of the 2020 Munich Security Conference was Westlessness, and 2021 was beyond Westlessness. So it's the idea that actually, if 2020 was an urgent call to action to say, well, you know, we're in danger of losing our dominance globally, then 2021 is actually about rediscovering that dominance and actually moving beyond Westlessness into a domain where the West can start to compete again.
And I guess we mentioned it at the top, the absence of the former president, American President Trump, and the inauguration of President Biden obviously changes the entire picture of geopolitics. But would you say we're now back on a path of multilateralism, or is that legacy of President Trump going to last?
Well, I mean, I think in this sort of post-Trump era, there's definitely more of a desire to see multilateralism promoted once again, to build bridges, and also, as I mentioned before, to sort of try and increase the West's competitiveness. I think, I mean, Trump's popularity is undisputed, even though obviously he lost the election. But the fundamental point is that there are still going to be those people who feel like Trump's approach was the correct approach. that actually, in a sense, the US wasn't getting a good return on investment in security terms, that it was putting in far more than it was getting out. And that was emphasized by some of the rhetoric that was used by Trump and also members of his administration, particularly referring to the EU and Germany as enemies. But I think there are more people at the moment who don't see security in purely transactional terms. So I think with the Biden administration, you're going to see a return to what you might classify as more traditional United States foreign policy. And that is going to entail promoting more constructive relationships with the European Union, with NATO, and, like I said, repairing and building these bridges. The fundamental point being that there's, I think, going to be a recognition that the strategic and security objectives of the West, which includes Europe, of course, are actually the same as those of the United States. There's a phenomenal amount of overlap, particularly relating to things like the rise of China and Russia, and the need to compete with these states. And I think that kind of reasoning is going to prevail, and we'll probably see a return to the idea of multilateralism in broad terms.
I can see Rebecca was trying to get in there. Rebecca, could we therefore call it wastefulness? And let's take a relevant example. How does it apply then when vaccine nationalism is taking all the oxygen of the headlines at the moment?
So I think we'll probably stick to multilateralism because it's easier to say than wastefulness. But I think it's just a label. What we're talking about here is very simply a message that the transatlantic alliance, if you like, wants to get across to the rest of the world. And there are some things that really do need to be done multilaterally. So sustainability is one, and John Kelly was very keen to push the agenda that we have to start thinking in terms of more sustainability, and that's not just the climate, it's also these issues around inequality and social sustainability as well. And we've seen that very, very clearly in the COVID pandemic, because we've seen this retreat to economic nationalism, vaccine nationalism. There seems to be almost this competition in who can get the most people vaccinated, a little bit of vaccine hoarding. So there is a real sense that emerging markets and emerging economies are not getting access to the vaccine in the same way. There's been COVAX, and there was a real push behind saying, actually, if we all carry on like this, then we're not becoming multilateral. We're still being very economically nationalist. So if multilateralism is going to replace that globalization as a word, we have to address this almost paradoxical strategic challenge that we've got at the moment in economic terms, which is, on the one hand, we've got the rise of China and in a sort of revisionist state sense, the rise of Russia as well. And the West wants to maintain its economic power against that, because, as Jack says, we've got this all means type of conflict that's developing, strategic conflict, which means trade and economics as well as military conflicts. But then we also paradoxically need to bring the world back together again. And that's really the dynamic that's going to be focusing attention in foreign policy and in trade terms, because trade's absolutely central to that particular agenda. Trade over the Trump era became a tool of conflict. And I think what we're likely to see moving forward into this coming year is a lot more focus on technology and industrial policy as a means of coming to terms with both working together and isolating China.
And I guess one question thereafter is then, why did the EU launch its trade strategy last week?
So the EU trade strategy is really interesting because its title was Open Strategic Autonomy, so that while at a rhetorical level there is this very clear focus on multilateralism and as a sense that Biden's going to bring America back to the table, rejoin Paris, etc., etc., there was an element of PR around that particular launch. Of course there was. So it was post-Brexit, post-US elections. It was around the G7 summit, Munich Security Conference. It was a good time for the EU to say, actually, we have an independent voice here as well. We have an autonomous voice here as well. And we want to express that in trade terms because that's what we're good at. So we're very good at sustainability. We're very good at regulation. We are going to be better at digital than we are at the moment, and so we need to think about how we merge those agendas together to create a regulatory framework that allows us to compete and develop alongside what's happening in China, so particularly Alipay and financial and so on. So it's also an extremely important transatlantic relationship. So it's worth just under $1 trillion globally, our whole trade relationship, or the EU's trade relationship with the US, and it's all strategic. So it's pharmaceuticals, it's automotives, it's aerospace, it's precision equipment, services and intellectual property. And actually it's a totally transatlantic shared agenda. If you look at vaccines and vaccine development, it's been a testimony to how well that transatlantic relationship works. BioNTech is German research and American development. So it's terribly important that it came out around this time. But the other interesting thing, and I'm sure Jack will have things to say about this, is that there were two huge elephants in the room. One was Nord Stream 2, obviously the gas pipeline, and the other was China. And there has to be a shared agenda around that.
Yeah. What are your thoughts on that?
Exactly what Rebecca said about Nord Stream and also China. So fundamentally security in the modern era, what some people refer to as sort of information age, is all means. So it's not appropriate any longer to compartmentalize between military means or military objectives, economic objectives, and civil objectives as well. So everything all at once. And for me personally, that means that the sort of strategic or security objectives of the European Union are inexorably linked to those of the United States. So although there was an element of this idea of autonomy in the European Union's trade strategy, I don't think that will also sort of relate to the security in the security domain, because essentially you're going to see similar agendas that are being pushed by the leaders of European states and also of the United States in Biden. So von der Leyen, for example, sort of re-emphasized what Biden had said. Biden had said, America is back, and that was echoed in the statement by von der Leyen as well. So essentially, this is about partnerships, and I'm not convinced that the European Union is actually going to be pushing autonomy or assertiveness in any kind of an aggressive way against its allies, because that would mean a return to this kind of multilateralism. And I really think that there's a shared agenda of rebuilding trust and building relationships. So I think perhaps the language that was used, this idea of autonomy, perhaps you could interpret it as being related to no longer wanting to be a slave to the sort of forces that have disrupted institutions, the sort of populist or nationalist forces, the interference in legitimate democratic processes. So things like elections, and perhaps this is more about the European Union saying, well, no, we're a strong institution, also to perhaps assert some sort of authority over the United Kingdom, because obviously the European Union, its survival, is going to rely on no more countries actually withdrawing from the European Union. So perhaps this was actually a sort of rhetorical exercise to actually say we're a strong institution, and even though our agendas are sort of overlapping, we're not gonna lie down for anyone.
A final question to you both. Where does this leave the UK?
Oh well, the UK was actually there this year, so a big shift in emphasis compared to last year. The UK still has to define what global Britain means, and in the context of, let's call it, if not autonomous, then assertive EU, a stronger bond, transatlantic bond, and a question around how the UK fits into all of that. I think the UK has to think very carefully about what its strategic objectives are. It has to align its trade and strategy towards Europe, as well as towards what its current focus is, which is the Indo-Pacific region, particularly through the CPTPP. And at the moment it's going around Australia, New Zealand, trying to get all of these trade deals together. Strategically, that's very important. China might join that alliance, US might join that alliance, and it's kind of almost the UK trying to isolate Europe, if you like. But in the end, the UK's strategic approach to this has to be of paramount importance, because we're seeing UK exporters being affected. Their revenues have dropped, the counts have dropped, there are fewer of them. The city, there's been nearly 7 billion flowing out of the city since January. So these are all things that the UK needs to think about, particularly as it's now fairly isolated. It's a smaller trade economy outside of these blocks, and it's beginning to look like that isolationism is so last decade.
Jack, final thoughts?
Yeah, well, I mean, again, this relates to the point I've been making throughout this chat, which is that the priorities of the EU, of NATO, and also of the United Kingdom are very, very similar. So NATO's releasing a strategy called NATO 2030, which is a sort of 10-year look into the future about what the sort of strategic priorities should be. And it's about this idea of protecting the people and promoting prosperity and things like this. But the NATO Secretary General, Jens Stoltenberg, basically said that we need a strong military, but in order to survive, essentially, we also need strong societies. And this is almost exactly what the United Kingdom's prioritizing as well. It's not just the promotion of its military objectives, it's also about the promotion of societal unity as well. And this idea that we can't achieve our security objectives if we don't have unity at a national level. So I think the point here is that the United Kingdom is still going to be pushing its. I mean, I hesitate to say something like this, but a kind of like a Britain First agenda. This idea that the United Kingdom has to look after its own interests. I mean, that's the fundamental point of Brexit. I mean, it's about reclaiming a bit of autonomy from the EU. So I think that you will end up seeing a bit more of assertiveness from the United Kingdom, particularly in its relations to the EU. But I wouldn't necessarily expect that to affect its security relationship with the European Union, because, as I've been saying, I think there's an enormous amount of overlap in the priorities and also the objectives, strategic objectives of the two blocks.
Wonderful. Let's leave it there. Thanks for your time, both.
Thank you.
Thank you.